Good afternoon and welcome to today's work session. Today we have two items that will be before us. The first is to present information regarding a preliminary draft recommendation on the Cobb County 2050 Comprehensive Transportation Plan. The second is to present information regarding the American Rescue Plan. We'll start off with DOT's presentation, and if we can have DOT come up, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time and having us today. We're really excited to be here to talk about all the work that went into, that's gone into this plan, all the work that went into Mobility May. We know that y'all did a lot of work to help us with that. We want to thank you for helping to facilitate those town halls and those conversations, providing the CTP ambassadors that could help get the message out about what it was that we were doing. It's actually the other presentation. And so we got a lot of really good input. And so what we want to do today is share with you a little bit about just a reminder about what the meetings we had, what kind of input, what kind of attendance we had at those meetings, what the results were of that, as well as our scientific survey. And to do that, we have our friends from Kinley Horn. I'll introduce Christina here in just a second. And then the second part of our presentation, we want to talk about, okay, where do we go from here? So this will primarily be about the CTP at first, and then we'll transition that, and then county staff will present a little bit more about Mobility SPLOST and some of the options moving forward. So without further ado, I want to introduce Christina Pastor from Kinley Horn.
Thank you, Drew. Yep. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairwoman and Commissioners. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I just want to also reiterate what Drew said. Thank you so much for all of your support through this last round of engagement, especially. The town halls were tremendous for being able to engage your constituents, so we really appreciate that opportunity.
Thank you.
So what I want to do is just give you an idea, and Drew touched on what we want to accomplish today with the CTP presentation. First of all, we just want to touch on what we did in this last round, just to remind everyone. I think you guys have probably seen the presentations more than you care to remember, but we'll just go ahead and just remind everybody what we took to the public, and then also talk about the methods of engagement and how we went about gathering that information. We'll spend the core piece of the presentation focusing on the results of our survey efforts, and then talk a little bit about next steps. So first, let's talk a little bit about those presentation, the materials we brought to the public. So as you well know, with any good planning process, the first thing that we have to do is start with understanding where we are today, understanding those existing conditions. From there, we can understand what are our transportation needs today, and what do we believe that our transportation needs are going to be in the future, and in this case, 30 years into the future. So after we define those transportation needs, we have to develop a list of projects that can look to potentially address those. So how do we develop those projects? First of all, they come from previous planning efforts. The county's been doing a lot of planning over the years. We have a lot of input from the public that we received in our first round of engagement, so we gather those different projects as well. And then also a tremendous amount of technical analysis, focusing on things like mobility and understanding access to important community resources like parks and schools. So we develop all of those different projects, and then we evaluate them. As you may recall, we developed 6 overarching goals at the very beginning of our process, and we use those goals to develop metrics to then evaluate the different projects. And from there, we're able to develop a prioritized list of projects. The next step then is looking into our funding. Because as we all know, with our own personal budgeting, there's always more needs and more desires than there is money to be able to accomplish all of those things. So it's really important that we're making the best use of taxpayer dollars. So from there, we did some financial constraining. We looked at possible funding sources, everything from project-specific funding and local funding, all the way up to state and federal opportunities. But the predominant focus for us for constraining is based on local funding, and particularly large local funding sources like sales taxes. So what I want you to particularly keep in mind is that we brought to the public is a slightly constrained list of projects, but really still quite aspirational. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, how we got to that 3% sales tax for 30 years. Our primary goal in this last round of public engagement was to be able to get feedback from the public and to be able to use that to help further constrain the list of projects. So the first category of projects focuses on surface transportation. We had approximately 457 roadway projects as well as active transportation projects. So just a reminder, active transportation includes bicycle, pedestrian, and trail type projects. So what you can see there is the mix. The ones that are shown in green are active transportation, and the ones that are shown in yellow are roadway projects. It was about an 80-20 mix when it came to overall cost of those projects. Now, beyond what you see in the map, there are also different set-asides for other types of projects. We did not identify specific sidewalk projects as a part of this. We did, in fact, set aside dollars to be able to help implement those. And we're going to be working on an evaluation framework for identifying specific sidewalk projects as the county moves forward. We also had money for operational and safety improvements, technology, and other joint city-county opportunities, beautification, and streetscape. So then we moved on to transit. What you can see here, we broke down the transit into two major categories. Priority corridors, which were the high demand, high quality of service. And what you can see there is those lines that are shown in red on the map are the projects that we identified to be high capacity transit service for our transit scenario that we put together. For the most part, in this scenario, we have assumed that the majority of these can be bus rapid transit. When we talk about bus rapid transit, we're talking about buses that are running in a largely dedicated space, so they're not mixing with traffic. They have special signal priority, high-quality stations, special branding, and people have the ability to get their ticket when they get before they board. So that's the first piece of our transit. The second piece is the supporting transit network, and that includes a number of different things. It includes some of the local service that you see. The local and rapid are shown in one of the lighter purple colors. The darker purple lines are represented by the commuter service, for the commuter service where we're focusing on getting people to and from work on a daily basis. The third section is those lighter purple areas. Those represent our on-demand or microtransit areas where people have the ability to call or go online and request service, and the actual bus would come to their home location, pick them up, and drop them off somewhere within that zone. So when we put both of those pieces together, and we add additional capital, operations, and maintenance, that presents our initial recommendations for transit. The third component of what we brought to the public included 3 potential heavy rail connections connecting back to Atlanta and the existing MARTA rail system. 2 of them connect to Cumberland, one from the Art Center MARTA station and one from the Bankhead station. The third connection is from the H.E. Holmes station over to Six Flags Parkway. So the important thing, there's a couple of important things when we talk about heavy rail. One is that it is the highest capacity of all services, so we can move a lot of people very quickly. It's also the most expensive of all of the services that we're looking at. So we need to think really long and hard about making decisions around heavy rail. The other thing to keep in mind is that for each of these different connections, depending on which route you select, 50 to 85% of the route is actually located in Fulton County. So a tremendous amount of partnership and collaboration would be necessary with the county, the city of Atlanta, and MARTA in order to make these move forward. Now, we don't know exactly where the financial breakdown would fall relative to local funding, but for the purposes of our efforts and where we are with this planning effort, we have assumed that the brunt of the local funding would really fall to Cobb, and obviously those conversations could continue in the future. So that was what we are using for our planning purposes right now. So when we put all of those pieces together, we have 3, as I mentioned, 3 overarching components. The first, those surface transportation projects that we presented, constitute about a 1% sales tax increase for 30 years. Then we add the transit projects that we showed, and that captures another 1% for 30 years. And then finally, we showed 3 potential heavy rail extension projects. Now, realistically, for the purposes of financial constraining, we wouldn't build both Cumberland connections. We would really only need to build one. And so for the purposes of our financial analysis, building 2 of those, one to Cumberland and one to Six Flags, is about another 1% sales tax. So when we look at all of that together, we're looking at about 3% for 30 years. Now, we know that that's not even feasible at this point in time under the current legislative guidance. But then beyond that, we also know that there's probably not an appetite. And so we have further constraining to do. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important that the input that we received from the public will help to guide some of these financial constraining beyond this point. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how we went out and engaged the public. Our focus was really two-part. We had some focused stakeholder engagement that really was targeted to our technical committee, meetings with the cities and the CIDs. We presented to the Transit Advisory Board, and we obviously had work sessions with the Board of Commissioners. In the process of the next steps, we're actually going to be conducting meetings with our adjacent communities because we want to make sure that we're coordinating well with projects across the borders. And we're also going to be meeting with regional transit operators. Then we also had our public-facing engagement, and we're going to talk in more detail about that. But that included public meetings and town halls, surveys, pop-ups, and meetings with our CTP ambassadors who went out into the community. I'll talk about them in just a little bit. And then website and social media engagement. So, in terms of some of the meetings that we conducted, we hosted 3 different virtual public meetings, and then also the 4 town halls that you thankfully all organized for us, and we were able to attend. Between those 2 events, we had probably 300 to 350 participants. Staff also attended 2 of the transfer centers and was able to talk to riders, current riders of the system, to get their input. We conducted 2 surveys, one online with about 1,000 responses, and the scientific survey with about 4,300 responses, and we'll spend some more time talking about those. And then, as I mentioned, the CTP ambassadors that you identified were great for getting into their communities and contacting their networks and engaging people and helping them to get involved in our process. We also know how important advertisement is, and the Cobb County Communications Department was very helpful in this as well. We were able to get press releases out and had some great feedback coming, and information and spotlights come from the AJC and the MDJ. We leveraged the county's social media platforms to be able to reach your existing networks. We had email blasts that went to different people who were interested in our process. We had yard signs and postcards and flyers spread all around the county, and we also had window clings that went into the buses and into the transfer centers to make sure that the riders were currently aware. In terms of being able to get some of that collateral out into the community, we distributed flyers, postcards, and public meeting notices to over 150 different locations in the county. And that included things like shopping centers, grocery stores, libraries, universities, and medical centers, all of the places where people are starting to more and more engage, and we want to be able to reach people where they are. Obviously, during COVID, it's been hard to do that because everybody's been in their homes, but as people go to the grocery stores and make some of those essential trips, we've been able to try to engage them with some of the collateral that way. And then, of course, the CTP ambassadors being able to reach additional locations beyond these 150 that you see here. So that summarizes all of the overall outreach and engagement that we did in this last round. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the major takeaways that we received from our outreach. Slide's a little bit text heavy, but I wanted to make sure that we covered a couple key points on the methodology. So what you'll see today, we had 2 surveys. The first is our online survey that was open to anyone to participate. So you could be a resident, an employee, or you could just have a vested interest in the success of Cobb County. The scientific survey was different in that it was a random selection of Cobb County residents. So if you were not a resident, you were not able to take this, and it was a random survey that went to different people. I want to talk also about some specifics about the scientific survey. It is representative at the county level and at the district level. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the results and some of the comparisons between some of the districts based on what we heard. We are technically finalizing one component. The renter population we felt was a little bit low. We wanted to have a little bit more. So we are in the process of doing some supplemental surveying of the renters to be able to supplement our survey results. We feel comfortable that it's not going to make major differences in our results, so we felt comfortable coming to talk to you today about where we are. The numbers will change, but we don't think that they're going to be drastic. But just want you to know that the renter sampling is underway. And obviously, when that is completed, we will update all of the results, and we'll be able to do much more detailed analysis of what we see across different subgroups and populations. The other thing that I want to make sure to emphasize, You're going to see a lot of percentages throughout this presentation. The percentages do not always represent the entire sampled population. People had the ability to opt out of some of the questions. So some people may have opted out. For instance, we asked a question of, would you like to provide input on Cobb's direction on transit? Some people may have said no. So in that case, any percentages you see are the percentage of the population who actually answered that question. So I just want to make sure to reinforce that. Okay, enough with all the background and the methodology. Now for the fun stuff. So some of these will look very reminiscent of what I showed you in the beginning, because these are some of the questions that we asked directly of the public. So one of the questions was, for surface transportation, what are your thoughts on the balance of projects? So once again, reminding, active transportation, shown in green, represents bicycle, pedestrian, and trail projects, and the yellow represents roadway projects. So we wanted to get a feel for, are we in the right balance? Are we getting the right mix of projects? Now, one of the other things, just from a presentation standpoint, we've tried to show anything that was the online self-selected survey with that green bar, and anything that was a scientific survey result with the red, just to try to help you keep track, because it is confusing to follow two different surveys simultaneously. So what you see here, for the most part on the online survey, about a third of the people said they liked the balance of projects. We didn't need to change anything. So no change doesn't mean status quo. It just means that they like the balance that we presented. But you can see for both the online survey and the scientific survey that almost 50% of the people that answered this question felt like they wanted to see more active transportation projects. But on the other hand, we still had about 20% of the people who said they wanted to see more roadway projects. Now, on the scientific survey, people had the ability to tell us they didn't want any additional active transportation projects. They thought the county had enough. And so that was an option. And then they also had the ability to opt out, excuse me. Now, I do want to make a couple notes. When it came to district-specific results, what we tended to see was that districts 2 and 3 were more interested in bike ped projects, and districts 1 and 4 were more interested in some of the roadway projects. Also, interesting piece of information, of the people that took the survey, approximately 20% of the residents use trails on a regular basis, and about 40% of them use them sometimes. So about 60% of your resident population is using your trails at least some of the time. Okay, so we also asked about specific projects. Now, we did not give them the entire slate of projects to choose from, because we know they'd have been here for hours doing the survey. Now, they did have the opportunity. We had an online interactive survey where people could go on, they could click on each of the individual projects and learn about it and then give us their feedback. Some people did choose to do that, but within the structure of the survey itself, we asked a subset of specific projects within each category, and we had about 3 to 4 from each commission district to make sure we had good geographic coverage. Now, in broad generalization about all of the projects, it really helped to, I would say, confirm some of the things that we generally believe. One is that people are most interested in projects that are close to them and that affect them the most. And so what we did see for many of the projects was that people in the district where the project is located or right next to it were most interested in some of these projects. We also found that some of the more regionally significant projects drew support and interest from across the county, more so than some of the other projects. And then the third is that some of the projects that were more commuter-focused did tend to often interest districts that were not necessarily close, but may have been in the commute pattern that would be improving it. So those were some broad generalizations for the projects themselves. Now, what you see here, these are projects that, of the 12 trail projects that we asked people about, these are the 3 top projects that really rose to the top of popular projects across both of our surveys, so the online survey and the scientific survey. So what you can see here is the Silver Comet to Atlanta Beltline Connector Trail, the Cobb International Boulevard Trail, and the Noonday Creek Trail. Now, one of the things that's interesting about each of these 3 projects is they actually tie to existing trails. So it's really great to reinforce and hear from the community that they love the trails that they have, and the ability to continue extending those further is exciting to them. Next, we have some of our major roadway projects. Once again, some of the projects that rose to the top, and these are, like I said, just a subset of projects, were the McCollum Parkway, Cobb Parkway, and Kennesaw Due West realignment, the Cobb Parkway at Windy Hill Road grade separation, Roswell Road widening, and the Barrett Parkway widening. And then under safety and operational, You see the Windy Hill Road at I-75 improvements, Dallas Highway at John Ward Road, East-West Connector at Fontaine Road, and State Route 120 at Johnson Ferry Road. So obviously, we will be, as we wrap up the full scientific survey, we will be doing more summary of these different projects and the feedback that we heard. So now let's talk a little bit about transit. The questions that you see here were asked only on the scientific survey. So we asked people, of the respondents that participated, what is their current use of public transportation? 17% of the people that responded said that they were current users. We also asked about their current use of the MARTA rail system. 4% said they regularly take the train, and 21% said occasionally. The remaining 3/4 of the respondents rarely or never take rail. Now, I will say in terms of district responses, one of the things that we did see more significantly is that District 1 is more inclined to not use transit and to not use rail. The next question was, of the people that do take public transportation today, how are they primarily using it? About 20% of them use transit within Cobb. The other 80-ish% are really split between connecting from Cobb to Metro Atlanta and then using it strictly outside of Cobb. And in this case, District 2 was more likely to include transit outside the county. The final question that we asked in this section was if Cobb should consider new transit opportunities. And what we heard was that 71% of the people that answered this question did feel like the county should continue to move forward with new transit opportunities. And specifically here, we heard from District 4 a stronger inclination to want transit. Now, we started to dig a little bit deeper and talk specifically about our priority corridors. Now, these priority corridors are really focused on those high demand movements and places where we want to be able to move as many people as quickly as we possibly can. So we know that depending on how the county moves forward, we may not be able to prioritize high capacity investments in all of these corridors. So we wanted to hear from the community, where are the priorities to them? So what you can see here is some very interesting similarities. On the left, you can see the online survey, and the right, the scientific survey. Both of them prioritize the top 3 being in the 75 corridor. And the fourth one basically is connecting from Cobb into North Fulton. The online survey prioritizes more of a perimeter connection, while the scientific survey connects more along into Roswell. But it's interesting that those were the top 4 across both the different surveys. Now, we also asked people about their interest in heavy rail. So we told them that it is possible that if we make an investment in heavy rail, that it would take potentially 40 to 60% of a new sales tax. And so should we be considering heavy rail as we move forward? On the online survey, about 52% of the individuals said that we should. And on the scientific survey, 63 of the respondents said that we should be considering heavy rail. So of course, then we asked the next follow-up question, which is, where should that connection be made? So when we look at that, interestingly, across both of the surveys, just over 80% of the respondents in both cases said that Cumberland should be the priority connection, and then the remaining 17 to 18% was focused on Six Flags. Now, it's interesting then when you get to a district level, you can see a much stronger, logically, draw for District 4 to Six Flags relative to the other districts, but even still District 4, recognizing that many of those individuals might still live within a reasonable proximity and travel of Cumberland, are also interested in seeing Cumberland move forward. Now, when it comes to if we make a decision about heavy rail, we recognize that the transit priorities that we presented to the public in this scenario, we would not be able to move forward with those projects as planned because rail would obviously be such a significant investment. And so we asked people who voted yes to heavy rail, what would they like to see for the remaining portion? Should we focus on priority corridors, or should we focus on the supporting network, get basically the coverage piece of this? And so what you can see here is on the online survey, about 2/3 of the population that answered the rail question in a positive way said that they'd like to focus more on priority corridors. Similarly, you can see still a priority focus on priority corridors in the scientific survey, but once again, you can see a difference there that District 4 is more oriented toward coverage than the focus on priority corridors. Now, for the individuals that said that we should not consider heavy rail and we should move forward without heavy rail, we asked them, did they like the mix of projects and the balance of priority versus supporting network, or did they want to see more priority corridors or more supporting network? And so what you can see there is, of the people who answered, now you'll notice on the scientific survey, people had the ability to opt out on that one as well. So they could say none, that maybe they don't want to see any of it. But of the people that did answer that question, the majority of them did like the balance. They liked to keep it the same. But some of them did want to see more priority corridors, and some wanted to see more of a supportive network. Oh, and I should mention that for District 4, that was actually a significant response to keep it the same relative to Districts 1 and 3. So now we get to ask the fun part about how we actually go about funding all of these different projects. So we asked people across both of the surveys if they would be willing to support a new sales tax for surface transportation and for transit. And so what you can see here is that approximately 50% of the population that answered the survey said that they would be willing to support a new sales tax for either one of those. We have about 35 to 40% that said no, and the slice of the pie in the middle of those that are unsure. And I believe, I don't have this in my notes, but I actually believe there was a significance between District 1 and District 4 in terms of District 1 not supporting either of the taxes and District 4 being more supportive of both of the taxes. Okay, so then breaking this down, we're in the home stretch, I promise. Breaking this down further, for the individuals that said they were either willing to or unsure to support, we asked how much they would be willing to support. And so you can see that stratification is anywhere from a quarter penny to a full penny. And so here we see in the online survey, about 54% said they would be willing to support a full penny. On the scientific survey, it's still the majority response, but it tends to be a little bit smaller. And we see a little bit more focused on the quarter penny there. And then on the new sales tax for transit, once again, we can see the majority of folks being willing to support up to a penny. It's a little bit stronger here on transit than it was on surface transportation, but we also see a slight decrease when it comes to the scientific survey with a little more focus on that quarter penny. So those are the results of, and once again, there's going to be more results, but we didn't want to bore you to death today, and we have lots more slicing and dicing to do when we're all done. But I want to talk now a little bit about some of our next steps. So project prioritization is really important. As I mentioned, the input that we receive from the public is going to help us to further refine these projects and to identify priorities moving forward based on whatever potential funding opportunities might lie ahead. And so we're going to be wrapping up our public engagement efforts and all of our reporting. We're going to be making revisions to those project recommendations and for both surface transportation and transit. We're going to be conducting a lot of modeling and looking at the scenarios to see how they perform. Because once again, we really want to make sure that we're identifying projects that will serve the community the best. And some of that is looking at mobility and its effectiveness to be able to move people, geographic coverage of projects, and equity considerations across the county. And then also, it's easy to talk about 30 years to some degree, but when we start talking about 5 years, 10 years, and then stratifying from there, it starts to get a lot more challenging. So what we're going to be doing is breaking these 30-year recommendations down into 5 and 10-year as well, so that we have some shorter-term recommendations to help guide with decision-making in the future years. We're also going to be making some policy recommendations. We're in the process of working on 2 different technology roadmaps. One is for smart cities, and one is for connected and autonomous vehicles. We know that as technology continues to evolve, we want to be able to have Cobb County be ahead of the game. And so preparing for that and trying to identify what you can be doing now is really important. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't identify specific sidewalk projects as a part of this process. We are working on developing an evaluation framework that can either be used to identify places where we need sidewalks or to evaluate projects as residents ask for additional sidewalks to be able to evaluate those as they come in. We also know that transportation and land use, they are inextricably linked. And so you're getting ready to embark upon a comprehensive land use plan here in the coming year. And so we're obviously just going to be scratching the surface when it comes to land use recommendations, but some higher level policy guidance that we recommend consideration of as we think about the connection between transportation and land use as you move forward into the comp planning effort. We also know that asset management is really important. It's great to talk about exciting new projects that are coming online, but if we have to also make sure that we're taking care of projects and existing infrastructure today. Transportation demand management is also something that's really important. We talk a lot about supply and demand, but so much of the focus of what we do is really focused around supply, widening roads or adding new infrastructure, but a lot of it really focuses on demand. Planners have been talking about demand management for a while, and as terrible as COVID has been over the last year and a half, if there's one thing that has really been valuable for us, it's learning that we have the ability to change the way that we work, that we have the ability to telecommute and can be able to do that. And so we don't necessarily always have to get in our cars and drive to our jobs first thing in the morning. So there's a lot there that we have learned from COVID, and there's a lot of other opportunities for continuing that transportation demand management conversation. We also have opportunities to look into some freight. We have some freight projects that have been identified, but also thinking about just policies in general, focusing on at-grade crossings or some of the considerations for different residential neighborhoods that might be near industrial areas and some of the freight projects that intersect there. And then also safety. We once again have safety projects that we have identified, but there is a movement, that Vision Zero movement, moving towards zero deaths. And so thinking about policies to really improve safety at a holistic level at the county. So those are just some of the policies that we're going to be working on. And then finally, we'll be continuing to coordinate with staff and elected leadership, all of our documents and reporting, and then be coming back to the board, ideally for adoption in the fall of this year. So we obviously want people to stay engaged throughout this process. The website is still live and we are continuing to update it. You can follow us with #CobbForward on social media, and the email address is also up and running, so if people have questions or comments, they can absolutely send us emails, and we're gathering and organizing all of those. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation, and I'm available if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you for that presentation. I know it was a lot to distill, and we have done a lot in a short amount of time to get as much information as possible. Commissioners, do you have any questions for our consultant? Any feedback? Why don't I just...
Copy of that.
Okay, first, yes, all of them would like a copy of the presentation. I think that would certainly help. Curious to know if anyone has any feedback. No feedback? Oh, good. For now, it was a lot. We're still maybe absorbing it and
Okay.
synthesizing. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Christina. So we did also want to talk some about mobility SPLOST. And before I get into the meat of this, really want to differentiate between mobility SPLOST and the CTP. So the CTP, of course, as y'all know, is the Comprehensive Transportation Plan. It's really vision is the word that comes to mind for me. It's a 30-year vision, irrespective of specific funding strategies or the cycles that come in and out through the county, whether it be general fund or SPLOST or grant funding. It really is just focused on big picture vision. What does transportation need to look like in 2050 based on where we're going as a county that's currently close to 800,000 that will be up closer to 1 million in 30 years. The mobility SPLOST is really more a question of policy, and that's really more of a question that we look to the board for direction on. And so the goal of this presentation is to facilitate a conversation, let you know what we've done as far as to try to garner input, suggestions, and insight from our partners, both in the private and the public sector. So what we want to talk about, so in addition to all of those great meetings that Kimberly Horn and you all helped us put on in May, we had discussions with other counties, with other professionals about just to gain insight into just lessons learned and things that Cobb County should be considering, as well as discussion with our cities. We do have representation from our cities here today. I see Mayor Thurman and Mayor Easterling and a few of our city managers from across the county. So thank you all for attending. They're an important part of our county, and we want to make sure that they're at the table with these discussions, given the importance that it has on the future of transportation in Cobb County. So we also did some research across the country looking at recent referenda. What were some elements of those that we can share with you, and then also talk about the county options. What can we do as far as state law here in Cobb County, what that schedule could look like, and next steps for the programs. So first, we met with Clayton County. They were very gracious with their time. We met with Chairman Turner, COO Dietrich Stanford, gave us a lot of great information about what's happened in Clayton County. And so by way of background, Clayton County is the third smallest by landmass county in the state of Georgia of the 159. They have a population of about 300,000. They have a lot of people coming through the county on a daily basis. Of course, they have Hartsfield-Jackson, the airport there. They've got a lot of interstates coming through. So there's a lot of transportation that's going on within the county. Of course, the airport is their major economic driver. In 2010, of course, that was, and we remember some of the financial challenges that Cobb County had in that time. Clayton County had them as well. And so they ended up having to end their transit system just due to a lack of funding. And so those next few years, they walked through a process and working with MARTA. And you see there in November 2014, Clayton County voters approved a referendum to join MARTA. So they actually became a partner county within MARTA, along with DeKalb, Fulton, and the City of Atlanta. Within that referendum, they allocated half of their 1 penny to go to MARTA service, half of that penny dedicated to a future commuter rail. And then they really stressed, so some of the insight that they gave there is coordination and communication. Just like any effort, coordination and communication was vital. Understanding the contract that they were going into, and understanding the partnership that happens there. So right now with Cobb Link, that's a county service part of Cobb DOT. Any of those issues, the operations, the maintenance is handled through Cobb DOT. Bringing in MARTA brought in just a different element of coordination, of understanding that they're one county of now a much larger system. They emphasized monthly communication. Again, they came back to talking about partnership as really being key. Just by way of, again, of background, Clayton County has a sales tax of 8%, including the MARTA sales tax, and that referendum passed in 2014, 74 to 26. We also spoke with Fulton County. So Fulton County was very interesting, given the number of cities. There's very little unincorporated Fulton County today. And so you see there, they looked at the House Bill 106, 170 option of a transportation, a 5-year transportation-focused sales tax. And Fulton County's role in this was really facilitator. And so they laid the framework for the cities to really take it, to run with it. You see there that they focused on congestion relief and roadway projects. There was no transit funding at that time. Again, in 2016, this is before House Bill 930 passed. And so really the limit on county SPLOST, county transportation SPLOST at that time, was the 5-year, could only be on capital. They are looking at what they're calling T-SPLOST 2 in November of 2021. So next, we met with professionals. And so we spoke with Greg Teague and Mike Sullivan, as you may know him as Sully, about could ACEC just help us gain a broader scope of professionals in the industry to talk about best practices and what they've seen, not just in the state of Georgia, but across the country in terms of transportation and transit referenda. And it's specific mostly to SPLOST, but they did bring some expertise in other referenda. And so they were asked to look at these 5 areas. How transportation transit can address inequities, foster economic development, what other funding mechanisms could the county be looking at, and how can we leverage regional transit opportunities looking outside the borders of Cobb County, and what are some of those lessons learned? So here are just a few of the takeaways that came from that group. It's a conversation that's ongoing. We hope to have another meeting with that group just to discuss in a little bit more detail. But so in terms of equity, the first thing they emphasize is having a clear definition. Equity has a lot of different definitions. In making sure that we're very intentional about what we mean when we say equity, if that is a goal, and to have a lot of early and often input and engagement from multiple stakeholders, and then focus on the focus on it is important, especially as we see with FTA and the federal funding that's coming out now. Equity is becoming more and more of a component within those funding opportunities that are very competitive. So on the second one, in terms of economic development, the group talked about how transit and transportation can be a partner with economic development and how they can be mutually beneficial, and to identify the anchors that exist both today and in the future that can be leveraged for that mutual benefit, and then focus on transportation and transit throughout the entirety of the county and how that looks in different corners of the county. On that third area regarding funding mechanisms, they mentioned it's unlikely any one funding mechanism will be sufficient to meet the expected needs of the county. And this is what we've seen over our recent SPLOST programs. We've seen in the 05, 11, 16, and 22 SPLOST programs, the county has invested in what we've called the state, federal, local matching funds, where we've partnered with CIDs and the state and the federal government to deliver projects within the county. And they recommend that model continue in any opportunity that's looked at here. And to pursue those multiple funding sources, to have an eye towards some of those external sources identified, as well as some of the internal local sources. On number 4 there, you see in terms of regional transit opportunities, it's really what they recommended is to make sure that we are looking regionally to where Cobb County sits in the larger region, and how we can, again, back to that key word of partnership, how we can partner with the Atlanta region as a whole to facilitate effective transportation. And then identify how priorities have changed post-COVID. I think we've seen pieces of that through the public involvement. We saw, as Christina talked about, a high emphasis on active transportation with people being home more of an emphasis and a desire to be able to go out and enjoy the community that they live in instead of just being focused on A to B every day. And then finally, lessons learned. They talked about some of the pillars of successful initiatives come down to making sure that the politics, the infrastructure, and people are all working together, helping people understand the clear benefit, to have that elevator speech of what exactly the program offers to the public as a whole, being clear about how accountability and funding transparency are part of the referendum, and I think Cobb County has done such a great job with the SPLOST programs. It really speaks to that accountability and transparency. The group talked about some of us ride it, all of us need it, about how even if we don't ride transit or use the specific transportation system that we're talking about, the specific improvements that we're talking about, we rely on those who do, and the use of that system does have benefits and kind of other impacts on the system as a whole. And then they talked about some of the common reasons for failing in it, and it's what you would expect. It's not having that communication. It's too much money, not the right mix of projects. The other that's not on this list that we thought was interesting, and I'm about to turn it over to Laura to talk about some of the other municipalities, was actually in Broward County. When you look at particularly a transit program that's so long, because we have to look at operational funding, when you think about a 30-year program and identify a project, and it's like, will I ever see that project actually be built? And so what Broward County did is they identified a subset of projects that were early deliverable projects to be done within 5 years. And one of the best meetings of the month came with our cities, and it had some really, really great conversation. We had representation from all 6 cities, both on the staff side as well as on the elected official side, to just take a bus tour of Cobb County. We talked about some of the things that we've got in the near future in terms of our Marietta Transfer Center, our Cumberland Transfer Center. We met at the Busby Park and Ride and all hopped on a bus and rode down to the Battery, and just to get a better feel for what services we offer currently, what potential services could be offered in the future. In terms of talking about the legislative options, and I know we've talked about them, between the 170, 106, and the House Bill 930, they were concerned, or there was concern expressed about the potential overlap in the communication of what's the difference between a 5-year transportation SPOST and the 6-year existing SPOST. We've got transportation in our general SPOST. Here we are talking about another. How are these different? On transit, we talked a lot about a hypothetical Ms. Jones. She apparently lived in Ackworth and Powder Spring in a lot of our cities. And the idea was, how does Ms. Jones in my city benefit from what you're proposing? How does she actually use it? What does this mean, to use a phrase from one of our GIS maps that we've used in SPOST in the past? What's in it for me? And then finally, discuss the balance between 22 and 24. So I think we've talked a lot about when does this go to the voters, and really it comes down to the compressed timeline in 22 versus the cost of delay for 2024. What do we miss in those 2 years? So with that, I'm going to ask Laura to talk about. She did some great research on some other referenda throughout the country.
Excuse me, Drew.
Yes, ma'am.
And hi, Laura. We do have 2 mayors who are here. Will we give them an opportunity to address the board? And would you like to do that following the presentation, or is this a good time to allow them to?
If I could
Away.
suggest, we've got a slide here a little bit later that talks about the 2 legislative options.
Okay.
And then some of the benefits on the 2.
Okay.
And so that might be a good time that we can invite them.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, good afternoon. Just wanted to show you a few examples of some other metro areas considering, and cities, specifically local governments, considering referendum related to transit as well as some roadway. The main thing to look at, we didn't go too far into the specifics, but you'll see there's a variety of funding mechanisms and, a little bit of change in the package and how these proposals were presented to the public. So the first one is LA Metro. They called their effort Measure M, and it is a combination of highway and transit projects. And in this particular example, you'll see that they actually had a renewal of their existing half-cent sales tax, and then they added an additional half-cent sales tax. So that's a different component. They were estimating about $860 million annually over that 40-year period. And they had a variety of different types of projects. They were expanding their bus system and some rail system, adding some additional regional rail, but also making some street improvements where they had below standard type streets they needed to rebuild, as well as a lot of state of good repair. Now in the LA example, they also worked specifically to have a reduced transit fare program for seniors and students and disabled. So that was something unique to the LA Metro example. And also, of course, a lot of bike and ped connections as part of their package. Another example is in Austin, Texas. Now, they had the 2 different propositions because of the way the Texas state law was designed, much like Georgia's, where there are 2 different types of referendum. Prop A was focused exclusively on transit. They had a huge transit plan called Project Connect. And then they had a second one, I'll go into that in a minute. And the second one was Prop B, and that was on mobility bond is what they called it. So the first one with Prop A was actually an increase in their property tax millage, and then also a dedication to a portion of the operations and maintenance portion of the property tax to go for Project Connect. So they were changing that dedication in their property tax from operation and maintenance on roadways and transit to a larger transit expansion plan. Here they had it's a very long program. They identified an initial investment of 20 years, and they estimated that 20-year program to be $7.1 billion capital costs. And in estimating about half of that with federal funding, the balance would be from this property tax revenue source. After that initial investment, the property tax was in perpetuity to continue funding operations for transit. The Prop B was using a bond mechanism for $460 million on roadways, excuse me, and capital and bike ped. The third example is in Houston, Texas, similar state law, but they decided to go a route where they actually were bonding, borrowing $3.5 million against their future sales tax revenues. And in this one, it was focused on new and expanding transit as part of that bond money. Each of these had some element of enhancing local bus service as well as expanding paratransit, adding a regional component, and adding some either light rail, heavy rail, or combination of both. And in that one, they also emphasized they wanted to make sure their connections to the two airports was very strong, so they were adding additional service there. Okay.
Thank you, Laura. And then this is a review. I know y'all have seen this slide many times, but the legislative options in front of us, a 5-year surface transportation capital that can be up to 1% for up to 5 years. And then a 1% transit, both operational and capital, that can be up to 1% for up to 30 years. And then in terms of timeline, between the 2022, we just listed a few of the benefits of looking at either time frame. So the 22 would represent a responsiveness to recommendations within the CTP while mobility is fresh on the voters' minds. And then it allows for kind of a quicker leveraging of any funds that are available just based on some of these immediate plans. 24 would, of course, provide additional time for analysis, public involvement, and to onboard a potential citizen advisory committee to let them know of all the great work that's gone on in the CTP over the last 2 years. I believe we said this at the retreat. The questions are relatively simple. The answers are very complicated in terms of what the next steps are here. And then just to share, this is what a schedule for a 22 referenda could look like. These are highlights. There's subpoints to really each of these. A few that I'll note is coming out of this work session, we've got some drafted bylaws and resolutions for your consideration about putting together a mobility citizen advisory committee, as well as directing staff in that advisory committee about developing potential project lists. December 2021 would be presentation of those project lists and that work that has been done. And then March would really begin what I call the march to put it on to the ballot, all of those various IGAs and resolutions to actually get the ballot language finalized. And so this is where I wanted to land, and we'll bring any of the mayors that would like to speak. As far as next steps, so you see there, what we're suggesting to take some advice from Erico is to go big and scale down. So to identify what is the max, so the max is 2% of each, what does that project list for each of those referenda look like? So that when we come back in December and share those results, we can see very definitively what it is that could be done, and then what direction we could receive from the board to scale that down into whatever measure y'all may deem necessary or worthwhile at that point. Perhaps the direction is, thank you so much for your work on House Bill 106, 170, the 5-year. Right now we want to focus on transit. Maybe it's vice versa or a combination of those two referenda. And so, but more immediately, we would look for a few agenda items on the July 13th meeting, within July 27th, if approved, appointing any of the nominees as applicable in those bylaws. So, Chairman?
Thank you. I appreciate all the work you've done to gather all of this information and connect with as many stakeholders as you have within the county and in the metro area. You've presented some different things for us to consider and some decision points for us to consider. And these aren't new for us because you've been asking us to consider these for some time. We just need to make a decision on these. And with the timeline that you've presented, if you can go back a slide, he had 2021. So the next meeting that we do have, you will be looking for us to begin to establish the advisory committee.
Yes.
And then the decision points for the other matters with respect to length of the program, the amount of investment if we choose both programs, a full penny up to each or an increment thereof. Would you be looking for the advisory committee to help make a suggestion to the board and then for that to be determined?
We can add that to it. Right now, what we had suggested for that July 13th is that the board would direct staff and this advisory committee to build out those programs
The list.
so that then we can see more specifically what is possible within the two of those.
Okay.
If you would like, if the board would like for part of that to be a recommendation on what the advisory committee suggests that the board move forward with, we could add that to it.
Okay, so primarily building out the project list.
That's correct.
I'm just trying to assess when you need to hear from us, really on those key decision points, I think is going to help determine the framework for how this moves forward.
Yes. So the July 13th meeting would be resolutions instructing staff and the advisory committee to begin that work, and then we would look in December to come back to you in a work session to present the results of that work with the committee.
Okay.
And then from there, we would look for direction of proceed with one or both of the referenda at whatever level, so that then we can begin the work in 2022 with very clear direction about what will be put before the voters in November to further scale that down as necessary and to begin the public education outreach.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the board members have any questions? Commissioner Brawl?
Good job, Drew. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
all this information. We had been asked to give some names for a committee. Is this the same committee, advisory committee? And how many members will it be? And do we have a representative from each of the cities and two from each of us? Or what's the makeup?
We'll send out a draft later this week about what we're thinking on that. There's a couple different ways that it can go. In terms of kind of the makeup of the two referenda, it makes it a little interesting in terms of what our assumptions were with the cities. So on the 5-year transportation SPLOST, we would assume that we would split that based on our typical percentages of the cities getting approximately 26, 27% of the revenue, and then they would, similar to what Fulton did, we would ask them to build their own list because they know their communities better than we do. In terms of the transit, that affects the entirety of the county, and so trying to look at those two things. So we've got a couple different models that we've looked at. One would be Gwinnett's, where they have representation from each of the districts that we would ask the board to nominate to. As well as specific interest groups where they might bring in groups that are interested in elderly mobility or economic development, and that those would self-nominate chairs and vice chairs. So any direction or opinion that y'all have on the makeup of that committee, we'd love to hear, and we'll incorporate as much of that as we can.
Yeah, well, I think it would be helpful for the board to see the feedback we received from ACEC, from the different consultants. It was insightful when they were speaking of the interest in people, politics, and infrastructure, their suggestion to ensure that we have consideration for all the interest groups that could be at the table. And so I typically think narrowly as far as district or geographically, But, with the advisory board, I think it's worthwhile to consider those unique interest groups so that they're not left out of the consideration of different projects. Do any other commissioners have any feedback? Gamble?
Drew, I'm not sure if this is for you or Christina, but the improvements that you're doing along 41, are we still looking at BRT going down 41?
I think there were a couple different projects. Christina, can you speak to that?
Yes, there are a number of different projects, and I don't want to speak to specific ones. One of the things that maybe we could give to Ross as well when he sends you the PowerPoint presentation is a link to the interactive map, so you could actually look in specifics if you wanted to see some of them. But we do have both BRT projects, at least on portions of 41, and we also have surface transportation projects, I believe, on portions of 41 as well. But I don't want to be able to I can't speak to the specifics of each of them, but we definitely have considerations of both. We have talked in the process about the consideration of overlapping projects between roadway and transportation or transit, and how we reconcile some of those differences depending on which of the referenda may move forward. So that is something else that we've been considering.
Okay, because if I recall correctly, I think it was about in 2015 that Croy Engineering did a study and pretty much said BRT was not a viable solution going down Cobb Parkway. So I'm surprised to hear that it's being brought back right now for the CTP. And
But they're
what
in
has
different
changed
places.
since 2015 to now make it viable?
I don't know, is it worth pulling up this?
Sure. Can you pull up the other presentation?
So it's only a portion, and obviously, so one of the things to also talk about is that a lot of these corridors need a lot more further study. There are portions, we looked at a couple of different alternatives. If you go back to the very, oh, I have the clicker. Apologies. Okay. So as you can see, there are portions that run along 41, but then there's also portions that cross 75. So obviously, each of these would need to be studied further, and part of that was trying to also reach some of the different neighborhoods that might exist in portions. But each of these individual routes needs to undergo a tremendous amount of concept work. These routes are very preliminary. They are meant for representing the basic connections and routes that could work. But by no means are these finalized recommendations. Each of these individual corridors needs to be studied further.
Can you pull up the connection or the preference on the connections too?
Oh, wait a minute. The 9 priority corridors?
Yes, and what the public wants there, and then I'll address. So, in remembering back to some of those efforts, and then if you could click forward to what the public input was. So, the previous effort on 41, looking at that, the Connect Cobb and the Northwest Corridor, recognized that much of the cities and the economic development happen along that Northwest Corridor. Some of the challenge with just looking at that corridor in and of itself is, for a lot of, and this is what we heard some in the public, was, well, once I get to 75, once I get to Cobb Parkway, I'm through 75% of the battle at that point in terms of my commute. And so looking at that east-west connectivity, which some of what this graphic shows to play into that, to make sure that it is something that it's not just looking at the last part of that commute, but looking at that east-west connectivity as a piece of it as well.
Thank you. Drew, I'd like to, again, recognize our mayors who are here, and thank you for taking time to come to our work session today. If any of you would like to address the board, this would be a great opportunity to do so, as I know both of you took your time to join the county and other cities when we did a tour, bus tour of the county. Yes, wonderful. Yes, Mayor, thank you.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, to all of the guests, good evening. I just had a couple of questions. one of them is a point of clarification. Can someone tell me, what is a scientific study? What does that comprise of?
Apologies, thank you. So the difference between the two surveys, the first survey that we had was anyone had the ability to take it. So it is a self-selected survey. We have no control over who does or does not take it. The scientific survey is meant to represent as best we possibly can the population of people that live within the county. And so it, from a population standpoint and general demographics and district breakdown, the number of people, the survey gets essentially adjusted and weighted based on the number of people that participate. So we have to have a certain number of people, and then some of the results, then we can see statistically significant differences between the results of different groups. So the idea is that it is a random selection of participants, so not anyone just gets to participate. And then also that it is as representative as possible of the population of people in the county.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
My next question is, you spoke in terms of 30 years. Is that directly correlated to it being paid for in 30 years, whether it's a penny or half a penny, or does it deal with the population going from 800 to 1 million?
Sure.
Mayor, can you repeat the last part? Does it deal with the population going from,
I beg your pardon?
okay, population growth over that time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So in terms of the analysis, it looked at where the additional jobs, the additional population was to be added, and then looking at kind of reasonable funding sources and estimations of what kind of the typical breakdown is in a general SPLOST, as well as some of the legislative options with a mobility SPLOST to say, okay, based on where we know the employment growth is, where the population growth is, and what the menu of options in terms of projects would be, what are the priority projects that are needed in order to facilitate mobility for the growing population and the growing employment? Does that answer?
Kind of, sort of.
Okay.
A lot of words.
Okay.
So in that 200,000 additional people, have you been able to assess where that growth is going to be in the county? Because that brings me to my next question, the service of demand in certain parts of the county, whether that's going to still be in existence. I still haven't gotten a clear answer on the flex bus.
Sure. So Christina can speak to a little bit more of exactly where, but yes, they did look at where they expect that growth to be and where the employment is expected to be. In terms of the second part of your question, I'm sorry, can you?
So what I'm asking you, if you're anticipating 200,000 people to move into the county, and based on your plan, so do you have a specific area in which the growth is going to take place? And is there flexibility in your plan to address that issue? And especially with the demand service in Powder Springs and other areas where we don't have transit. So if there's going to be growth there, I'm trying to understand how you're going to fix that if you're not sure whether the flex bus or on-demand service is still going to be in play.
So yes, we do have it identified as far as specific locations, and we do, and that's in some of the earlier materials that we'd be glad to provide as far as where exactly that is. In terms of the flex, there are additional on-demand and additional services, and this speaks to, I think, a great point that you and some of the other mayors made of, if within your city, there's either some limited transit or no transit in some cases, and for some parts of the population. So how specifically would a mobility SPLOST, address those? How could it address improving flex and some of the on-demand services? How could it address providing and facilitating that growth? And so some of the projects get at that at a high level of some recommendations of things to consider. What we would look at in terms of a mobility SPLOST is bringing those people to the table, going out into the public and saying, here are the projects very specifically that would be on a November ballot question that we believe would address these, and then working with the public to refine those to a very specific project list with very specific policy recommendations on how we can improve transit service in your community.
Okay, so that sounds really good. So here's in your next steps, so going back to Mrs. Jones, who lives in Ackworth, how does this benefit her? So when will you be able to address those specific questions? Because obviously, I'm trying to see where the flexibility and how you're going to be able to share how this affects Ms. Jones and what the benefits she's going to get before we get to the balance.
Sure, sure.
In your timetable, rather.
Sure. In the timetable, it would be, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to turn my back to you. So in the timetable, sure, if you, oh, perfect. Thank you. I felt bad answering your question and turning my back to you. So in the timetable, this fall would be all about bringing that committee on board. And what we would suggest is, in terms of a model, is starting with this as kind of a foundation of these recommendations, of these areas to add projects, to add priority corridors, additional on-demand, to start with that and build out what we've called in the schedule. And if you go to the other presentation, sorry, I keep making you jump. We should have put them together. Would be starting with what I've called a 150% list. So starting with 1.5 times the funding, and then going out to the public sometime in the September, October timeframe there in 2021, and saying, okay, here's what we've developed as terms of 1.5 times the potential funding based on what we're receiving in SPOS revenues. Here's what that looks like, and going to your community, going to Ackworth and talking to Ms. Jones, and saying, here specifically, show me where you live, let me show you the map, and then we can talk about how this benefits her, and saying, okay, what did we miss, and what do we need to cut back on? Because if it's 150% funding, how can the committee work to cut that from 150% down to 100%, so that it is fiscally constrained? And then that really builds into 2022 when we turn into education of saying, okay, now we've met out in the public, we've talked to all the folks, and here's the project list, and here's how it benefits the different Ms. Joneses in the different cities in the county.
Okay, so I like that, but I still think there's a huge disparity in what the citizens understand, whether it's a transportation or transit project, and what they're actually spending money on. Somehow we have to do a better job on explaining that to the citizen. That's really all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may comment, oh, excuse me, we have Mayor Easter. I just want to comment before Miss Mayor Easterling comes up. Yes, Mayor. I appreciate your energy and your diplomacy, because you were kind enough to look at Ms. Jones and Ackworth. But, you know, when you look at that transit priority map, it makes you also wonder about Ms. Jones and Powder Springs.
Sure, absolutely.
And this is the conversation that I did have when I spoke to DOT about that map, is that we do need to see how we make this a priority for all of our communities in Cobb and our cities, particularly when we're coming and asking you for your partnership. Cities traditionally are the more densely populated areas of a county, and you know, part of the challenge that I think we discussed at our retreat at the top of the year is how this looks backwards versus looking forwards. And I think what you're asking is, what's the flexibility for us to look forward? That if we look where demand is today, then, you know, the priorities make sense. But if you look at where you can build infrastructure to help create access, which would facilitate demand, it might look different.
Absolutely.
And that gets to the equity piece. You know, I hear a lot about Ernest Barrett and how he helped to create growth in Cobb because he foresaw the potential here by putting in sewer infrastructure, and he built it and they came. My concern is if we don't build it, we don't facilitate people coming to areas where we have not built out our infrastructure. So as much as I want to facilitate growth where we see it today and where it's projected based on what we see today, I think what we have not had is a strong consideration for how we build out in areas that have not had the investment that other areas have, or else we're going to continue to see strong or more populated areas grow, and we're going to see those less populated areas not have that same opportunity. And so even though some things were not stated and what you so graciously stated. I want you to know what I'm seeing and a little bit of my concern about where the opportunity is with this, and that we're fully addressing access and opportunities in areas that have not had it.
You know, it's interesting, you know, I moved to Cobb back in 1983, and it always seems that development came before the infrastructure, and that's been a pattern. You know, and if I think in terms of Powder Springs, if some of the projections are right, we're right at 15, 16,000. Next 5 years, we could be at 20,000. So your projections now and what you're basing it on may not fit Powder Springs. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. Mayor Easterly.
Madam Chairwoman, Commissioners, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just, more of a statement. I think, I do know that SPLOST works, and I do know that we need mobility and we need transit. We need transportation issues solved. The reason I believe that SPLOST works is because the cities and the county, they've done a great job in educating the people on the benefits of SPLOST, what we can do with those dollars, what we can bring to them.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Mayor.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm sorry, sir. I hate to, excuse me, sir, I'm sorry. We're having difficulty hearing the mayor. Thank you.
What I'm suggesting, 2022 may be too soon. 2024 to refine some of the ideas, to plan a little bit more and to educate the people, the general population, on what we are going to provide as a benefit to Mrs. Jones in Powder Springs and Ackworth and in Kennesaw. I think that's up to us, and I think that's the better route to go. You got great ideas, you got a great team. Build your citizen advisory team. They're the ones that have to use this. They're the ones that are going to embrace it, or they're not. So get that buy-in. I'm merely suggesting that, that we not delay, but we focus on 2024 and in educating people so that we have 100% buy-in on transportation and mobility. So, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yes, Commissioner Richardson.
I do have a question for you, Drew. You've heard all of my other comments, so I will keep this one short. But when would you prefer to have an answer on the 2022-2024 question? Yesterday?
That would be helpful. So to this model of building the committee, developing what we can develop within the next 6 months, and then coming back to the board, I failed to mention that another decision point within that could be, instead of go with one, go with the other, go with both, could be very well, this needs more time. And so then we would look in December of pulling the trigger for, yes, we're going to continue and go for 2022, or as Mayor Easterling suggested, allow that to say, let's use this, continue to build on it, and build for 2024. So December, to answer your question.
Thank you, and really great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that would give us the opportunity to move full steam ahead and then make a determination. I share the same sentiment that the mayor has for Kennesaw, Mayor Easterling. 2024 would provide us time to build a lot more out and perhaps give us more time to make a case. And then I know from sitting in this chair, well, not this chair, but sitting on this board for 8 years, so much can change in a year that while people are thinking about transit, do we move forward with this versus something coming up where, even if we look at the political tides nationally, there's a lot of support for infrastructure. I don't know what that looks like later, so it's a hard decision for us to make beyond just a project list because there's so many things that could impact how people feel about infrastructure and transit and spending their tax dollars on it as the years go by. Is there any additional feedback from our commissioners? No. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Laura. Also, thank you to our mayors and your staff that I see that's here that took their time to come here today. We have a lot to think about and to consider how this moves forward. This is one of our top priorities for 2021 to help get this right. And so we have a lot of work that's cut out for us, and I look forward to us working with you, Drew, to make sure that we can hit these milestones, and for us to be able to best determine what's going to happen in December. I think it'd be helpful for us to follow through on that next milestone with the advisory committee. So from what I heard, you'll send out a framework by the end of this week that will help us to be able to consider that. Great. Thank you again. With that, we have another presentation for commissioners and our public as part of this work session, which is to present information regarding the American Rescue Plan. Because we just spent an hour and a half talking about transportation, why don't we take a break until 3 o'clock, and we'll come back and continue with that second presentation. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to our June 22nd work session. The second matter before us is to receive information regarding the American Rescue Plan, which we brought by Attorney Debbie Blair and our Finance Director, Bill Volkman.
Do you want to say anything first?
I will turn it over to you. Let you be the star of the show here. I'll be here for questions.
I was telling Bill that I thought my topic was somewhat complicated, but compared to the other one, this is just really easy. Yes, I'm here to, Debbie Blair with the Cobb County Attorney's Office, of course. I'm here to speak on the American Rescue Plan. And it is, of course, a COVID relief program funded by the federal government. First off, of course, it's different from the CARES Act. A lot of the uses from the CARES Act are still eligible uses under the American Rescue Plan, but there's a lot more restrictions and I think a lot more reporting requirements. When CARES first started off, let's see, we received those funds, I think, in April of last year, about. We had 4 pages of guidance on how to use those funds. Basically, there were 3 restrictions on it. It had to be unbudgeted, within a certain time period, and necessary because of COVID. The American Rescue Plan, they held off releasing any guidance for quite a while. They have now released an interim final rule, which is 151 pages long. So a little different there. They are also receiving comments right now through July 16th, and then the final rule will be received or sent out to everyone the end of summer or the beginning of fall. Which button? Point to you? Oh. Okay, sorry.
Do we want to mention the submitted comment?
Did we?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that we did.
Okay, sorry. See, and I said I wasn't going to say anything. So I just want to let the Board of Commissioners know that we actually did submit a comment on Cobb County's behalf. One of the eligible uses is revenue replacement, and it is viewed as an entity-wide calculation. As a part of that, we have to include our SPLOST revenues, which are restricted for voter-approved capital projects and cannot be used for operation. So we actually submitted a comment to the Treasury's office asking for that to be excluded because it would not help or benefit any COVID or anything related to the pandemic. So that was just as an FYI purpose, we did go ahead and submit that. We have not heard back anything yet, but we will definitely share with the board if we do hear anything. Thank you.
Thank you.
This slide depicts the 5 general allowable uses under the funding. The funding, as you all are probably aware, is going to be received in 2 separate tranches. We have received our first amount of funding, which is about $73 million, and the second equal amount will be received next year, 12 months after receipt of the first set of funds. The intent with that, according to what the interim final rule is saying, is that the plans for local governments is going to evolve as the recovery evolves. And that's going to look different for different communities. So they want to allow the communities the option to kind of evolve their plans as they need to in their local jurisdictions. Generally, the buckets are to support the public health response, address negative impacts to workers, families, and small businesses, replace public sector revenue loss. It provides for premium pay to essential workers, and there is also allowable water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure uses. The ARPA is intended for more of a general fiscal relief project versus CARES, which was, here's some money, there's needs, you need to get the money out. This is going to be, hopefully, the intent is a more strategic use of the funding. So the funding is available for use through December 31st, 2024, for costs that are incurred March 3rd of this year through December 31st, 2024. For the projects, the infrastructure projects, the funding may be used, it has to be obligated by the end of 2024, but can be used through the end of 2026. So long as the project is finished by that 2026 period. For the first two buckets of uses, and if anybody has a question, please just interrupt me.
And I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. That's much more favorable than what I thought would be the case, that we would have the flexibility to use it beyond the 24 date, as long as we obligated it.
Yes. For the initial two, the public health response and the negative impacts, of course, the funds must be linked to or respond to the COVID health crisis. So any use must be related to COVID. To determine eligible uses, it's the second part of the screen, you're going to need to identify a need or a negative impact that is caused by COVID. And then secondly, the program or grant that you are trying to enact needs to address and identify how that need, how the program would meet that need, would cover that effect. The uses here are fairly self-explanatory, supporting the public health response. One major change in this category is the public health and public safety salaries. If you all remember under CARES, there was a presumption that was allowed that stated that the entire salary for a public health or a public safety employee is covered was covered by that funding. It was assumed that they were substantially responding to or mitigating COVID. However, here in this particular funding program, in order to be, the salary is only covered to the extent that the employee is actually responding to COVID. So they must be, in order to be a covered response, they must be primarily responding to COVID in order for those salaries to be covered. As far as the second bucket of allowable uses as responding to negative economic impacts, these are similar to the uses that we did under CARES as far as housing insecurity, rental assistance, mortgage assistance, or food, small business loans, those types of things. Again, those are still allowed under this program if that is of interest. Added in this category is impacted industries, and the ARPA Treasury is encouraging that these funds be used to address the negative impacts for tourism, travel, and hospitality. One other note on that particular slide. Any assistance that is provided must be reasonably proportionate to the harm that has occurred. So whether it's a loss of a job or that kind of thing, it cannot be excessive, or that would be considered, it wouldn't be considered an eligible use unless it's proportionate. In recognition of the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on low-income communities, the rule allows for broader uses within qualified census tracts. And qualified census tracts are defined as a census tract in which at least 50% of the households have income less than 60% of the area median income. And for those businesses and those households that are within those census tracts, we can look at having broader and more encompassing services for those. Cobb has 10 qualified census tracts within the county. And then Bill touched on revenue loss. With revenue loss, we were hoping that we might be able to do this on a revenue source by revenue source. But the rule states that the calculation for revenue loss must be made on an entity-wide basis. So we have to look at the total revenue that was pre-COVID, so that would be our fiscal year 2019. And then there are two different ways that we can look at projections in order to determine what our revenue loss was. Of course, it's intended that the entity-wide shows more of an impact that COVID had on your local government, your jurisdiction. But again, it's very explicit as far as what items or what revenue sources need to be included. Although there are some exclusions, SPLOST unfortunately is not one of them. We're asking that question, if once we calculate our revenue loss and receive that, we allocate it. I would assume we're going to put that in a separate fund. Yes. Those funds that are allocated are considered revenue loss replacement. They have a broader use of, or broader, you can use them for broader projects. They do not need to be linked to COVID if it comes out of this particular bucket.
As for the infrastructure, it says including roads, so does that also include buildings in the infrastructure?
I'm sorry, which one are you looking?
Vertical, as the first line, maintenance or pay-go funded building.
Yeah, for this particular, once the revenue replacement is calculated and we set aside whatever that number is, then yes, we can use it it can be used for simply maintenance of any of our public buildings.
Okay.
I mean, that would be one of the allowable uses. But as well, and I'm going to get to reporting in a moment here, these funds we must also report back to Treasury as far as how we're using these funds. Even though we have broader uses, we still have to report how we're using those funds. The fourth allowable use is premium pay. And premium pay is intended to be paid directly to an essential worker, or we can do it through grants to a third-party employer. Premium pay responds to COVID when it is paid to those employees that faced a heightened risk of COVID by having and being required to be physically present at a job site. There are some examples of those employees listed at the bottom there. The Treasury recommends that we should prioritize, if we're paying premium pay, that we should prioritize those lower income eligible workers if we do that. And as also noted at the top in the first bullet there, if you are able to telework, you are not eligible for any premium pay under the funding here.
That last one piques my interest. If you can go back to the prior slide. The last bullet, I know we've addressed premium pay for essential employees within the county. How do you address that outside of the county?
It would depend on how the program
When I say
is.
outside of the county, I mean outside of county government.
It would depend on how the county is structured, how the program itself is structured. You could, for an example, grocery store workers are considered essential employees. So we could make a work with Kroger or whatever a local stores here within the county, and we would set our parameters. These employees worked during this time period, they were present on site, and the employer could make that payment to the employee, or it can be by application and direct to employees that would provide proof that they had worked during the COVID time period.
Okay, thank you.
And the last broad bucket of uses is for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The eligible uses would be for the water and sewer, it's projects that would be eligible for financing under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And the Treasury is tying the projects to those two funds because it deems that those projects would be considered necessary. So unfortunately, it's not for for a broader use than what those two funds would allow. I know we have a dam situation, and I was thinking that might fall under there, but we are not allowed to use the funds for assistance and repairs for dams. So it does have to be tied to those two funds. And then as far as the broadband infrastructure, that is to serve that infrastructure needs to serve unserved or underserved areas. So, and I didn't put in the MPGs and all that because I don't know what those are, but the level of service needs to be brought up to a certain level in order to be considered a viable project for funding under the ARPA funds. And again, or as to any work that is done, the contracts that we allow for these projects, we need to, it is encouraged that we look at contractors that hire local and that the wages that they pay will be higher than the average for the area. That isn't, they encourage it, it's not a requirement, but that is encouraged for these types of projects. And again, these projects, we must obligate, so we must enter into the contract by the end of 2024, but the project completion date must be by the end of 2026. And of course, there's some ineligible expenses as well. As we talked about, outside of the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure projects, any repair, or I should say upgrades to our public facilities that are COVID-related are also allowable projects. But anything outside of that, they're stating here, general infrastructure and economic development are not allowable projects. Now, those could fall into the revenue loss recoupment bucket, but whether or not that's something that the board would want to consider, again, that would be a board decision on how they look at that. You also cannot use the ARPA funds for pension fund deposits. And on the slide there, it describes the pension fund deposit is basically an out of normal deposit. If you are paying a public safety employee's salary and they have regular contributions to pension, that is allowable. But this is talking about a one-time, out of ordinary deposit. It would not be allowed. Nor can you use the ARPA funds to fund debt service for non-federal matching. You cannot put it into reserves, nor can you use it to pay off any settlements or judgments that might be pending in that time period. It would be considered an ineligible use. And then reporting, as I mentioned, we are required to report the use of funds, and of course we've got a 3-year period, so we're going to have a lot of reporting. Quarterly and annual reports are required. The recovery plan performance report basically describes our projects, provides status of the projects. In addition to that being required to be sent to Treasury, we need to also post that online. So our Cobb website will need to have that online as far as how we're intending to use those funds. And as with CARES, We are responsible for reporting how our subrecipients are using their funds. So we need to keep all of that under us. Treasury will use these reports to help determine whether or not the funds have been used appropriately and as determined according to their guidance and the statute. If they find that the county has misused the funds, or they think that we have misused the funds, they will send us a notice requiring us to repay the monies that were misused, and those funds must be paid back to the Treasury within 120 days. There is an opportunity for us to challenge that and provide additional information or a further explanation as to why we think we were properly using those funds. But again, if there isn't any reconsideration and they still find it a violation, we need to respond and return those funds within 120 days. And it's my understanding that will be ongoing throughout the 3-year period, versus really with CARES, it was happening so fast, we had to initially use those funds by the end of 2020. That was kind of an end of the grant that it was looked at, but this is going to be looked at throughout the period. And you don't have to listen to me anymore. Any questions that I can attempt to answer for y'all?
That was great information. I hope that you can send this to us electronically so that we can go back and take a look at all of the provisions. Do any of the commissioners have any questions regarding what was presented? No, not yet, Commissioner?
Presentation.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Is that it? Is this the end? All right. Well,
Yeah, 7 o'clock.
yeah. This is the middle of the end. Thank you for joining our work session. We'll be reconvening back in this room at 7 p.m. for our evening BOC meeting. Thank you.